Hello and welcome back to part 5. This time the topic is attributes. What are they? What kind of types do we have? Not the string boolean type, but other type. We'll get to that. And what are relationship attributes? That's the point. So my usual diagram, each entity has a couple of attributes. So it is data about that specific entity, something that describes it or provides further information. So these are attributes on entities. These are the attributes on entities. You can see some of them have different types of notation, and we will cover that. And then there's this one here, which is not an entity, because you can see that the dotted line goes into the relationship. So these are attributes related to the relationship, and that's a bit special. So we will get back to that also in this video. All right, so they are properties of the entity, meaning the actual data of that entity. And once we move further towards actually implementing our database, the entities will, in most cases, become our tables in the database, and the attributes on the entities will be the columns in the table. So you might have a stadium, and there are a couple of attributes: name, street, city, postcode, number of seats, for example. You could have an administrator with first and last name, initials, and password. The book might have some attributes, and an image can have attributes: file type, URL, title size, and so on. And a student might also have attributes. Right? So these are the attributes. They describe the student, for example. A student at this campus has a student ID. They have first and last name. We know when they enrolled. We know what program they are associated with. Maybe the program should have been an entity in itself, but not relevant here. And we know when each student is born. So these are the attributes. Okay, where do they come from? So similar to the entities and the relationships, well, this is also where we find the attributes. The description from the customer, the requirements, user stories, and use case descriptions. This is where you find it. Or if you're missing something, or something is unclear, you would go to the customer and ask for clarification or elaboration. They are often nouns, so like entities, but instead they describe the entities, so that may make them adverbs or adjectives. So for example, we could have a piece of description that says, and we want to keep track of admins about whom we must know their full name, initial, passwords, and email. So clearly full name, initials, password, and email. Well, password, for example, is a noun, but it is indicated by the text that this is data that belongs to the admin. They describe the admin. Full name, initial, password, and email is something that belongs to the admin. So usually we can read from the description whether full name should be an entity, or whether it's implied that it is something that describes the entity. All right, so that's what we're looking for. We have different types of attributes. And again, I don't mean strings, text, integers, booleans, all these types that you know from programming languages. It is just instead different ways of saying something about the attribute, which is not the type, but something else. Let's take examples. Okay, we have the symbol. The symbol attribute is something that cannot be divided into smaller components. So they're supposed to contain a single value. First name is a single piece of text. Same with the last name. Initials is a single piece of text. Same with password. I could have a full name property, which would then actually contain first, middle, last name, but that can still be considered in some cases an atomic attribute, atomic value that doesn't make sense to split down even further. I would not have an attribute with initials and full name together. I don't know what that would be called, but that's clearly two different pieces of data. So that's the idea of symbol. we can have something called composite. And this is essentially when you create an attribute which has multiple attributes in it. So if I have a name attribute, we can then see that a name consists of first name, middle name, last name. And according to notation form, you do that with indenting like this. There's 4 spaces or something like that, to indicate that these are sub-attributes of that, you might call them. Maybe you have an apartment that you want to rent out, and there's an address, and address then consists of this. Do you need composite attributes? Well, they are not really taken further than the ER model. So when you move along towards implementing your database, they disappear, and the name attribute would then just become 3 simple attributes. So first name, middle name, and last name, similar to what I have over here. So in that case, they don't provide much extra. Maybe you want to indicate that this is something that belongs together, and you might have a good reason for that. You might also figure out later on that address should be an entity in itself. So an apartment has an address. That's one way of modeling it. But I include the composite attributes just because you might see these. You might see what they look like. You might encounter them, so you need to know what they look like. I have different ways of well, this is the official way, what you're supposed to do, but not all diagram tools are good with this. So for example, my diagram made in Asta here, I have used an underscore to say these are composite attributes, or the address is a composite attribute consisting of these 4 sub-attributes. So sometimes we have to, well, Asta doesn't support spaces in front, so I cannot really make that. And there may be different ways of indicating a composite attribute. I have done it like this. All right. Back again here. That's the composite attribute. We have multi-valued attributes. They are indicated like this. The constraints here, so you say that a soccer team has shirt colors, and maybe they have blue, white, and red. So that would indicate 3 values. Again, you use it sort of like 0 to 1 or 0 to many. Well, 0 to 1 is not really, then it's just optional, but you define here how many is the lower and upper bound. So it could be 1 to 3, like this one here. For example, an employee might have multiple phone numbers for whatever reason, or multiple emails for whatever reason. So these are multi-valued. You mark them like this in the ER diagram. A common mistake is to sort of do a different entity, call it phone number, and then make a relationship between them with 1 to many. So an employee has many phone numbers, but that's not what we do in the ER model. We want to keep it simple, so this is enough. All right. These are called single values. These are the multi-values. We have something called derived attributes, and these can, the value of a derived attribute is calculated from some other available data. That means that sometimes they are perhaps a bit redundant to include because it is information that is already present but just in some other form. But sometimes it's nice to indicate that we want to have it. So I could have a student and they have ID, name, and date of birth. And then the customer wants to also have age. And if I have the date of birth, then I can obviously calculate the age. So that is marked as with a slash in front here, saying the age is derived. It is calculated based on something else. I could have a book, and a book can have an average rating. And that comes from each reader who has read the book, provides the book with a rating. So there may be thousands of ratings on this book, and we can take the average of all that data and have it as an average rating. So it is information that is being calculated based on some other data in your model. We mark it with the slash to say this is derived data. It is calculated from something else. These are the attributes we work with. Most of the time this will be what you need, the simple single valued. Sometimes you need some multi-valued, and sometimes you need derived. Composites, well, as I mentioned, you can always just do it as simple values, but you may have a good reason to indicate that something belongs together. Alright. Then we have primary keys. You should know about keys already. And primary keys, the natural ones, can be marked with PK, as this here. Or if you have a composite, then you mark both or all attributes involved in the primary key. You mark them as partial primary key. Okay, so you only put the natural ones. You're not supposed to invent new attributes to be used as keys. These are sometimes called surrogate keys. Right, only the natural ones. You may mark them if you want to indicate this. So I have a book. I know I mentioned previously that I have encountered that not always is the ISBN number available. But let's assume that in my system we know that all books have an ISBN number. So I could mark this as a primary key. I do it like this. I could have an email and maybe an employee, and maybe the email is the primary key. I know this is unique. ISBN is also unique. You have to pick a primary key that is unique, right? But sometimes email may not be a good choice. So yeah, in this case, it's just an example. You could put it here. I might have a movie entity, and with title, duration, and multiple genres, and a publication year, and there's no apparent candidate key here. There's nothing unique about this. Maybe I could combine multiple attributes to make a unique candidate key, but that's not always a good choice. And sometimes you might be tempted to introduce a new attribute. Maybe it's called movie ID, and that's the surrogate key that I talk about. That movie ID is not something that you're given from the customer. It's not something in the real world. It's not something that a movie has. It is something you want to introduce because you know that in your database the movie needs an ID. So you don't put these on. No surrogate keys, only the natural ones are allowed and not strictly needed. So don't add a movie ID, don't add an employee ID. These kinds of surrogate keys are not included in this diagram. Right. And finally, the partial primary key. I didn't have a good example. They are mostly used in a later diagram that looks like the ER diagram, but is slightly different. But assume you have an entity and their attributes, and these two together make up the primary key. Well, then you mark it as this partial primary key to say that this is part of the primary key. All right. These are the attributes on the entities. But I mentioned at the beginning of this this video, that there are also attributes on relationships sometimes. And in my example, I had readers and I had books, and readers can read a book and they can rate a book and they can review. And I've taken a sub example of the diagram you saw, because in the previous diagram I also had start date and finish date, but let's just go with read, rate, and review. So I have that a reader, well, that's my reader. I have put some whatever attributes here just for example, and some other attributes with potentially more. And a reader reads many books, and a book is read by many readers. So I have a many-to-many relationship. And we want to rate and review books. So the question is, where do I put this information, the rate and the review, these two attributes? And could I put them in the reader entity, could I have rating and review down here? Well, no, because for each reader, if I am an instance of reader, then I could just have a single rating and I could have a single review, and obviously I can read many books, so that doesn't match. I could make it a multi-valued attribute, so I had rating down here, rating, my best handwriting with my mouse, 0 to many, right? I might do this, but then I don't know which rating belongs to which book. The same with review. If I have a multi-valued review, then I don't know which review describes which book. I could maybe include that somehow, but it just becomes very complicated, right? So this is not a good approach. That's the result of this erase all link. There we go. Okay, so it doesn't belong in the reader, right? Does it belong in the book? Well, I end up with the same problem. If I put rating here, then it's a single value attribute, so each book can have one rating, and then multiple readers cannot rate the same book. And the same problem for review. I need to be able to have multiple readers review the same. If I make it a multi-valued attribute, then I still don't know which reader gave specific rating and which reader wrote a specific review, because maybe I need the option to modify my rating and modify my review. Then it's important to know which reader is owning that rating and review. So this is a common problem when you have a many-to-many relationship, and basically only when you have a many-to-many relationship. And the question is, what do we do with it? Well, we have multiple pairs of readers and books. Right? I'll try to illustrate it here. I have my two different instances of reader. Troels is one instance of reader and Alfred is another instance of reader. And I have instances of the book entity. And let's say, well, my Troels reader can read multiple books. Right? And Troels has read these books: Stormfront, The Martian, and The Boys. My Alfred reader can read multiple books, these two here. And then we can see that one book is read by multiple readers because The Martian is read by Troels and by Alfred. So that's where the many-to-many comes from. And each of these lines here is a reader-book pair, and each of these lines can have a rating and review. Right? Troels can review Stormfront, and Troels can review The Martian, and Alfred can review The Martian, and so on. So for each pair of reader and book, or one entity and the other, for each pair of these, we want to keep track of the rating and the review. Like this. Okay. The way it works is then that we introduce the relationship attributes, as we are talking about, so no big surprise, and it looks like this. It is a dotted line that goes to the relationship, and I have my attributes up here. Sometimes it will have a name similar to the relationship name, depending on what diagram tool you are using, but as per the standard, it's not necessary to give it a name. It's just what we have in Asta. Asta wants to give it a name here, so sometimes you will see it. But these are my relationship attributes, and it indicates that for each reader and book pair, there is a rating and review, potentially. Alright, that's the relationship attributes. And that's all for attributes. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next part. Or vice versa.